the key thing in any event, notice I've been talking about tort. The key thing here is there is no distinction between tort and crime. So right now, let's say, for instance, that I batter you, okay? And a battery, as you know, under contemporary Anglo-American law is some unconsented touching. Now, there can be a criminal conviction for that, and then separately, there can be a civil action. I can sue you for that, okay? What we're talking about here, I think, is a model in which that whole distinction goes away. There's no criminal action. What happens is precisely that the victim sues. The tort-crime distinction is basically statist. And so there is something odd, therefore, I think. This is one place where I think the Tannehills seem to be a little off base. The Tannehills talk about debts to victims of, quote, crimes as different from, quote, ordinary debts. But once you get rid of the notion of crime and you're just talking about tort, then I think all debts fall under the same heading. They certainly do in tort law today. Let's say I run into you and wreck your car, then I owe you compensation for that. I'm a debtor, and debt law functions here in basically the same way it would in any other context. I can assume a debt contractually, but I can also assume it by committing a tort. So the tort system already allows for intentional torts. I mean, that's what we would be talking about in a case where, let's say, I go out of my way to steal something from you or to damage your property or to damage your body. But it's still the case that what I'm liable for under tort law, damages that I owe under tort law, just becomes a debt that I owe the person against whom I committed the tort. So the Tannehills offer a detailed analysis of how everything would work with, again, as I say, insurance companies as the prime actors. I think the process that they outline would be efficient, and it would certainly be far less violent and costly than the one that we tend to observe today. Clearly, we can't count on the Tannehills to be perfect, though. We can count on them to be disappointing, I think, given enough time. I think it is a little odd that they talk about rejecting a really important norm in accordance with which people are innocent until proven guilty. It seems to me this is quite troubling. They offer an example in which the evidence is really obvious that someone has engaged in tortious conduct. But I think the point has to be that the burden is always on someone who wants to use force. I think we have to keep that point in front of us at all times. The burden has to be on somebody who wants to use force. And, of course, exacting compensation from someone else is an instance of using force. If you're going to take someone's property to satisfy a debt, you're using force. That's got to be justified. It can't be the case that the burden is somehow on the person who wants to protect him or herself to prove that she or he is entitled to protection. It's got to be the case that if someone wants to use force, that's got to be what's justified. Now, how that justification is offered is another matter. What counts as proof, as evidence in a legal context is certainly another matter, but the burden always has to rest on the person who wants to use force. Another separate issue to be talked about here. The Tannehills talk about compensation in economic terms fairly broadly. I want to offer the view, without really arguing for it in any detail, that compensation for economic harms ought to be economic. And that should also be true of compensation for the economic consequences of non-economic harms. So, for instance, somebody subjects me to some kind of emotional trauma as a result of which I'm unable to work and I lose money. That's an economic harm. But I think we might want to think about non-economic mechanisms for dealing with harms we don't judge to be economic, okay? Because the reality is, I don't think we want to treat every injury and every interest as economic. There are some injuries, there are some interests that are better seen as falling under some other head, as, for instance, relational. It used to be the case in American law that there was a legal action called breach of promise that you could invoke if somebody who had agreed to marry you backed out. It used to be the case that there was an action called alienation of affection, that you could undertake to use against somebody if that person caused your parent or your child to break relations with you or caused your spouse to divorce you. And I think it's fair to say that these are not themselves economic harms. Now, they might have economic consequences because they might immobilize you emotionally or something like that. But I think it's fair to say that they're not themselves economic, and I think we cheapen them and trivialize them if we pretend that they're economic. And therefore, I think there's something a little odd about offering economic compensation for them. I think we might want to think about other mechanisms, other kinds of social processes that we could use to address those kinds of harms. So, in any event, the Tannehills go on to talk from there about, quote, rectification companies. And the idea here, notice, is that if somebody is not able to pay a debt out of his or her own pocket, and if she or he can't work out a satisfactory arrangement to pay that debt while continuing to work and to function in the economy ordinarily, perhaps she or he might go to work for a rectification company that might keep him or her in fairly confined circumstances and take a lot of money from him or her to pay a huge debt. Now, I understand the kind of argument that's being made here, and certainly the Tannehills are clear in talking about this as a matter of voluntary employment in one sense. However, they clearly envision a situation in which people don't have many other options, and I think this really amounts to a kind of imprisonment that is potentially troubling. I think it could potentially incentivize slavers in one way or another. I think we've seen what happens with the private prison industry growing in our own society, and I think we certainly don't want to create a situation in which putatively voluntary relationships between the restitution companies on the one hand and the people who owe restitution on the other might not descend into fairly abusive ones.